Good evening, everyone. Tonight's speaker event is being recorded. My name is Emily Spence, and I'm the Associate Director of Education at Old North Illuminated. Welcome to tonight's speaker series event, and as always, thank you for your support of our programming. At Old North, one of our goals is to tell the stories of all the people and communities that are part of our site's physical, spiritual, and social history. In recognition of that, we acknowledge that Old North Church sits on land that was once the land of the Massachusetts people. By the time Old North was built in 1723, the Massachusetts people had been driven and displaced from their homes and decimated by disease and warfare. Their story and suffering has been obscured in the historical record, yet they survive and the memories of their ancestors live on in the Massachusetts community. As always, let us think about the lessons of history and learn from them. This year, we are celebrating the 300th anniversary of the founding of Christ Church in the city of Boston, also known as Old North. We have been marking this milestone with events and special programming throughout the year, focusing on shedding light on the lesser-known stories and exploring aspects of the religious identity of Old North and its people through the centuries. In April, we launched our new handheld audio guides. These guides weave together the stories of the signal lanterns, the Old North congregation, and the Black and Indigenous church members. This summer, we will also be hosting a play written and produced by Plays in Place for Old North called Revolution's Edge. The play takes us to the afternoon on April 18th, 1775, where we hear a conversation between Mather Byles, the Old North Loyalist minister, Cato, the man he enslaved, and John Pulling Jr., one of the lantern holders, in which they discuss their differing beliefs about the coming revolution and how their lives will be impacted. The play will be performed at Old North on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday evenings throughout the summer. Please visit our website for more information and to purchase tickets. If you are in Boston over the next few months, I hope you will come to Old North for both of these experiences. And now tonight, we are delighted to have with us Dr. Stephen Marini. When you think of controversial music, Anglican psalms may not immediately come to mind. However, I think tonight's talk will change that for you. When Old North was built, it was only the second Anglican church in Boston, a city that was dominated by Congregationalists who held strict rules about worship practices, including music. Old North's presence in the North End presented a challenge for the Congregationalists, and in particular, it was the psalms sung at Sunday services that inflamed the growing controversy surrounding sacred music in Boston. Dr. Stephen Marini is the Elizabeth Luce Moore Professor of Christian Studies and Professor of Religion in America and Ethics at Wellesley College, where he has taught since 1976. He is the author of numerous scholarly articles, essays, and chapters on colonial and early Anglo-American religious culture. He has published 5 books, most recently, The Castaway Psalmody, Transatlantic Religion and Music in Colonial Carolina, which has been awarded the Lloyd Hibbert Endowment by the American Musicology Society. He is also the founder and singing master of the Norumbega Harmony, an internationally acclaimed ensemble, and has presented more than 125 concert lectures. And in 2004, he conducted the ensemble in a recording called Sweet Seraphic Fire, which I did listen to on Spotify, and it was incredible. Before we begin, I'll just remind you to mute your microphones. If you have questions, or if they come up for you during the talk, please feel free to put those in the chat, and I hope you enjoy the talk. And now I will turn it over to you, Steve.
Thank you, Emily, so much. Thank you, Jamie, Emily, and Catherine for inviting me and making this possible. Jamie just sort of popped the question when she was giving a lecture at Wellesley, and she said, well, would you be interested? And I said, well, sure. I mean, who wouldn't want to help out Old North, a site that I've long admired and visited many times. And I was just saying these good folk, what a great job I think they're doing for their big anniversary, 300th anniversary this year. So I am going to talk to you about sacred singing, a little bit about organs, don't have that much to contribute there. But sacred singing was a hot topic on the 29th of December, 1723, when the first service was conducted in Christ Church. That controversy, or that debate, argument, is known as the regular singing controversy in New England. Regular, from regula in Latin, which most of those folks knew who were debating it, meaning singing by rule, by which they meant following the rules of harmony and composition, but especially following a method of learning music literacy through a system that combined letters, I should say syllables, and the notes of the scale. So one could sing the scale, which in those days went fa, sol, la, mi, fa. And you could transfer those syllables to a musical score. Then you could sound out the melody and associate it with the syllables. If you did this often enough, you'd actually be able to take a look at a score. And if you knew where the fa was, what we would call the tonic note, you could then read it and sing it according to the syllables. There were a lot of other rules involved, but this especially was the focal point, as we will see. So the controversy over singing to rule, officially, or at least in terms of historians, is said to begin around 1719. Note the date. It went roaring on at least through 1725, and there are some pamphlets as late as 1728. So it's almost a decade. It's actually, in terms of imprints, the largest theological and liturgical controversy in New England to that time. That includes things like the Salem witch trials. It's big, for them, it's big. It's about 24 pamphlets, but that's scale for them. So it is usually understood, because it's mostly musicologists, music historians who interpret it, as essentially an aesthetic issue. The cosmopolitan, learned Boston ministry didn't like the way the country people sang. And by at least some accounts, it was god awful. And it was slow. And they were just all over the place. They were ornamenting, and the leaders were all these sort of geezer deacons who may once have been pretty good at music, but their voices were shot like mine. And so the leading, which is what deacons usually did, was poor and slow and halting. It was a mess. So they wanted something better. They wanted to improve the performance style and caliber of psalm singing. We'll get to psalms and why in a minute. That's how it's usually understood. And some country people resisted, but they got run over by the clerical establishment. That in fact did happen. But I think that version of the history is very music historical. And I think it misses a much larger dimension, which involves Anglican and congregational rivalry in the city of Boston. And this rivalry, I believe, triggered it. It bears a lot of responsibility for why the controversy happened. And I want to talk about that larger tension and rivalry between those two communions. It was a rivalry that was at least 25 years long, and maybe longer. Frankly, as soon as King's Chapel opened its doors, the Congregationalists wanted to close them. And they tried to do that, certainly, all the way through 1722. And when Christ Church went up, it was sort of like, uh-oh, they're really here. Now we really have to deal with them, okay? The crowning move on the Anglican side of this tension was precisely the building and consecration of Christ Church, because it did make them permanent. It did give them a presence. And the building was huge. It dwarfed King's Chapel, which didn't have its new building from 1754 yet. It still had the kind of ratty old wooden one. And it was just a tremendously impressive achievement. And so we'll get to that. But the Anglicans then not just established a beachhead, they were significant players religiously, culturally, in terms of an elite level worship space and so on. So I want to try to explain how I see this episode, this rivalry, this tangle of, because music is at the center of it on both sides. So the Princeton historian John Murren has proposed that the early 18th century was a time of what he calls Anglicization. It's not Anglicanization. That would be everybody became Anglican. That didn't happen. Anglicization is the process, as he presents it, of the colonies, especially New England, embracing English and British, by 1723 it is British, culture as a colonial imperative or a colonial initiative. Why? Well, Massachusetts in particular had in 1692 lost its original charter, the one that it used to bamboozle the crown into essentially having self-government. That charter was revoked and a new one imposed on them in 1692, same year as the Salem witch trial, by their supposed friends, William and Mary, King William and Queen Mary, who, William being raised in a Calvinist country, they thought, sure, they're our friends. Well, it turns out that William and Mary were, like good monarchs that we just witnessed this weekend, swore loyalty to the Church of England. You don't do that, you're not the king. So that was that. So that change, they were still in shock about that. And then the government of New England, the governor of New England, Edmund Andros, who ran something called the Dominion of New England, refused to acknowledge the charter or the new king and queen's legitimacy, basically set himself up as the ruler of all New England, and he faced a revolt, which drove him out physically and politically and militarily. So it's a very unsettled time in which the colonial relationship to England is very scrambled, very unsettled. They've already made some not friends over there by the way they've been behaving. Rebellion isn't welcome, and even if it's an illegitimate governor. And so the argument goes, they consciously, as well as unconsciously, oriented themselves towards things English. Print culture was booming. They bought early English, well, not exactly novels, but plays, all of the all the Restoration literature, very popular. Dryden, especially, and many others. And the same thing is true with clothing and styles and all the rest. This is what he means by Anglicization. It's a cultural reorientation away from we're independent of you, you can't get to us, and integration, because now they were simply bound to be part of the empire by charter. They were a royal colony. There's nothing they could do. So they started behaving like a royal colony, which was wise. Okay. So Anglicization as a cultural process is going on at precisely the time that things start getting unpleasant about sacred singing in New England between the Anglican and the Congregationalists. So that's where I'm going in trying to understand this, what's happening here at Old North. But first, I want us to look at two churches that were built right virtually at the same time. So, Emily, if you'd be good enough, you'll recognize the first. You know that one. There you go. So that's wonderful Old North. Not a bad shot, I guess. Okay, now the next one. Hang on, let me move what I say. Of course, this is the famous interior. And this, if you hold it there, please. Or is this automatic? Okay, it's good. This is where a lot of the action is going to be, because that organ wasn't there until 1759. And the first organ wasn't built and put there until 1736. So you have 13 years of no organs in Old North. And one of the questions is, how did they sing? What did they sing before and after these large instruments were put in? And just for reference, quick reference, I want you to notice how small the gallery is, where the organ is. I mean, the organ fills it up. If you take that organ out, you still don't have a lot of rows of benches, which is what they had. We'll get back to it, but just take note for now. Okay, now that's a vernacular style. It's a colonial appropriation of the architecture of Christopher Wren, Nicholas Hawksmoor. And if you know London, you know those churches because they were all built after the Great Fire, the Great London Fire of 1666. And that was the style. And even a century later, or a half century later, that's what the colonials wanted to build to say, we're English. So it's understandable why the Anglicans would. Now, if you would go on, Emily, we'll look at another church. Now, does that look anything like Old North? Well, of course it does. It's basically a meeting house style, big block with this towering tower. Same formula, a lot of the same actual ornamentation, windows, arches, and so on. Okay, next. This is what it looks like. This is a congregational church. So it doesn't have a wine glass pulpit. It doesn't have the 10 Commandments and all that good stuff up front. It doesn't have a prominent altar table. It does have box pews, and it does have classical references in the arched windows, and it does have a gallery all the way around, but it's a little different. And one more, please. So this is the gallery in Old South Meeting House, the rear gallery, or actually they called them the front gallery, because it was, to them, this was the front was where the tower was. So this is also narrow, but there's no organ there. And there's no organ because the Congregationalists sang their psalms without accompaniment. And Anglicans accompanied their singing if they were capable of doing it, if they had instruments. of which the organ was the premier. But there were other options. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, so these are cognate architectural expressions in an imperial restoration of the crown, 1660 style, that it's not a surprise at all that Old North would appropriate. But why would a Congregationalist do this? Well, one of the answers is Old North went up. This is 6 years later. The Congregationalists got the message, and they wanted to be English too. And there's a lot of imitation and yet difference. And that's what we've got here. We've got imitation and difference, sharing of some dimensions, and still polarity, a religious polarity, on the other hand. So the story of how sacred music expressed a similar move toward Anglicization that these two churches, I think, illustrate, is what I want to talk about mainly tonight. And it's more complex, but it again involves competition between Congregationalists and Anglicans to determine which of them was more au courant with sacred music styles and pedagogy in London. More English than thou. And that's the story I want to tell. But in order to get clear the differences between the Anglicans and the Congregationalists, who of course are cousins, the Congregationalists were known as Puritans, and they were Anglicans before they were Congregationalists. They were Anglicans before they were Puritans. And they were a reform movement within the Church of England first. So it's thick. The relationships are very complex. So I want to go back all the way to the English Reformation, at least briefly, and talk about how these two communions developed their similarities and differences in terms of sacred music. And that'll take a while. Then we'll go at the American stuff, and that'll take a while. And then we'll finally get to Old North, and I'll give you my best guess on what was actually going on there. The first place we have to go is Calvin and Luther. Martin Luther was a violinist or a fiddler, depending on which you think he was. He was also a poet and a singer. And you probably know that he wrote the words and music to "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God." Not bad. And you also know that that's probably the most famous Lutheran hymn. It's not a psalm. King David didn't say "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God." Luther did. That indicates Luther's very firm position on sacred music for the congregation. We should use our vernacular music and tunes, and we should use hymns that we faithful believers write to praise God. We are not bound by Scripture for the texts that we sing to God. God would want us to sing our faith, that's Luther, our faith, not King David's. Okay? So the Lutherans were that way, and a lot of other communions went that way. But Calvin said no. Calvin, being a strict legalist Bible guy, said, if God gave us God's own book of divine songs to sing praises to him, who are we not to use it? So God says, and so does St. Paul in Ephesians, sing to one another, teach one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. Calvin said all of those terms from Luther all were rolled into the book of Psalms. So, and there are other hymns to God and songs to God elsewhere in the Bible, like the songs of Miriam and Moses in the Exodus. And there's Mary. She's okay. And so he said, the only thing we should sing is biblical songs. That meant the Psalms only, and these other canticles is what they're called, biblical canticles. So it's a very sharp distinction between the Calvinists and the Lutherans. And the question was going to be, which way does this Church of England go when it breaks away for no substantive theological reason and has to figure out what it's going to be in the middle of the Reformation? So Emily, we have I think another slide. I'm doing these slides from memory, which I don't know whether I'm right or wrong. Well, maybe we'll come across it later. So Edward VI was the one who reformed the church by giving it, the Church of England, by giving it its first Book of Common Prayer. And in the Book of Common Prayer and in the articles that are gradually getting developed of religion, the Church of England goes Calvinist and says only psalm singing and biblical canticles are what we're going to do in worship. And given that the C of E is a blend of half a dozen different Reformation traditions, is what it really is. It's a little surprising. There's a lot of Luther's influence in it that he went for Calvin and only the singing of psalms. Okay, but he did, and it's a long way till you get to Elizabeth, but Elizabeth essentially reaffirms that when she comes to the throne in 1559 and sets about translating the Psalms, or seeking a translation of the Psalms to be used in worship as Calvin said should be done. So under Mary, I'm assuming most of you know this impossible history of the English Reformation. I just can't. Okay. Under Mary, she tried to stamp the whole thing out and failed. And then in comes Elizabeth. And she says, well, I'm not my brother Edward, but the Psalm thing, I'm not going to turn that over. But where am I going to find English Psalms? English Psalms. The answer is Geneva. Because all the Calvinist Anglicans, and they were there when Mary came in, were exiled or fled. And they fled to all the Reformed capitals of Europe, Strasbourg, Basel, Zurich, but especially to Geneva, because Calvin was there. And poets went there. They knew Edward's mandate on Psalms, and they started translating the Psalms into English. A guy named Thomas Sternhold was the lead translator. There were plenty of them. And he and a bunch of his friends, and then an Englishman who didn't lead named John Hopkins, put together a complete translation of the Psalms in the earliest years of Elizabeth, and said, how about this? And she authorized it for use in Anglican worship. And there wasn't anything else authorized for use in Anglican worship. So the church acquired uniform psalm texts and the other Bible ones that every congregation, every parish were mandated to sing uniformly, at least in terms of text. This collection also has music. I think, Emily, that would be next. Let's try. Yeah, there you go. So this is what it looks like. So this is, the music was first interestingly enough. And then the text came second. So this is the end of Psalm 2 and the beginning of Psalm 1. This is the old notation system. It's recognizable, sort of, but you need to know what you're doing in order to find the real notes. But there you are. And this is also called black letter printing, which is very Gothic looking, right? I mean, it really looks medieval. Well, there it is. And every psalm had a tune, a different tune. Well, not all the different tunes, but there were a lot of tunes. A lot of them were French, it being Geneva. But there were other ones, other kinds as well, English ones. And this whole thing is a tome. You've got 150 texts and you have 150 scores. It's big. And everybody's supposed to have one if at all possible. That takes a while. So there you are with the first beat of the Anglican Reformation in terms of this imperative of psalmody. Okay? Yeah. All right. So then the next thing that happens is, try the next thing. Try the next slide. Let's see what. Let's see. Yeah, there we go. So these psalms, these tunes, you fast forward into the 1670s. Now you're in the Restoration. The English Civil Wars have happened. The Puritans rule for a while. Yikes. And then the Anglicans come back in. And the Restoration is what it says, not only the restoration of the crown, but it's the restoration of Anglicanism after a hiatus of 20 years. Poor country, you know, Anglican, Catholic, Anglican, Puritan, Anglican. But as you may know, the late 17th century with the Restoration is a time of great creativity, and especially musically, but also in terms of drama and art and architecture. This is Wren again. And so a group of musicians known as court and cathedral composers, tells you who hired them, took to harmonizing the tunes. Now that's a big move. Why? Because Calvin had insisted it should only be in unison. He said, if you're singing in three parts, God might get confused. God might not hear the words very well. Furthermore, it divides the congregation, and that should never happen. We should all be together. Well, musicians got a hold of it, and John Playford, after the Restoration, and a guy named Nicholas Ravenscroft, before, published these hugely popular editions of those same tunes from 1562 in three parts and in four parts. Now, who's going to sing those? Well, it seems pretty clear that this is designed to be sung by choirs, because not everybody can read music. But if you have a dozen folks who can, you can make a very nice, joyful noise to the Lord. If you're any good at all, singing in three parts or four parts. So Anglican psalmody becomes harmonized. Not everywhere, but these are hugely, hugely popular books. So one of the questions that is not answered yet, or even answerable, about Old North, when they sing psalms without accompaniment, because that's what this is, or with no additional accompaniment, I should say, is, are they singing in harmony or are they singing unison? Because unison is a hell of a lot easier. So, you know, and the leader just needs to do that and not worry about where the harmony is going. So so Anglican psalmody now is rolling along. We're doing really well. We've got the harmonized psalms. We've got this old but venerable. Okay, next. Emily, please. Right. So this is what Playford looks like. And for those of you who are musicians, you see how this goes, okay? The top two lines, the spacing is terrible. The top two lines, as it says on the left, so Psalms of David, on the left, it says cantus and bassus. That's melody and bass. So the top line is the melody, the second line is the bass. The third line is the next top line, is the next cantus. The fourth line is the next bass, and so on. And the text runs between the melody and the bass, okay? Two-part harmony was kind of, if you had any harmony at all, it would be bass, because bass keeps you in tune and does very well at that. But the third part that he advertised so prominently is separated. So whatever part you're reading, you're not reading in a score that all three of them are together. So if you're the alto, if you're the media, you're just singing your thing. And it's just a whole lot of fun to figure out what you're doing, because there are different scale markers. There are different key signatures and scale markers. These two are singing in the same clef, and this is in a different clef, the alto clef. So you read your part and you hope you've got it right, and you make harmony, you hope. It's pretty early. Okay, let's try the next. Ah, yes. So then we finally get to Boston, and the first emergence of the Church of England is King's Chapel in Boston, 1686. It's built out of wood. It has a tower that isn't much. It's pretty small in the first place. It is a chapel. It's not designed to be a parish church. It's a chapel. And if you know anything about the history of Boston, you see these weird wooden buildings, and you see Beacon Hill in the back, which looks a lot more like Blue Hill, because it was 430 feet high. And they cut the top of it off. Some of you know the story, to fill in the back bay and other landfills all over the city. But King's Chapel is there, and I found a reference in King's Chapel, in the King's Chapel records, that they, as early as 1691, were distributing free copies of the Book of Common Prayer and what they called the singing psalms. The singing psalms. That would be Sternhold and Hopkins, because the King James psalms are what's at the back of the Book of Common Prayer, because they are recited throughout the liturgy, morning prayer and evening prayer especially, where you go through them all. Okay, so within 5 years, they're importing enough copies of Psalters and books of common prayer to give away for free to anyone who wants to come and join their new Anglican congregation. That's already aggressive. That's already, we're here. We're not going anywhere. All right, let's go next. Let's see. The reason we're having to do this is because I sent Emily a different version than the one I finished with, and my brain is still in the one I finished right before. So I have to go back to like 2 PM and try to remember what it was then. So this is the thing. Now we're at the place where we're getting closer. We're getting to the moment when the whole impact of Old North is going to be felt, because as I see it, this new version of the Psalms is the beginning of all of this musical controversy. It happens in 1696. This is the second edition. It comes about because a lot of literary folk and a lot of ministers are complaining about Sternhold and Hopkins. And there's a good reason. Think about how much the English language would have changed between 1562 and 1696. What's in between? The Fairy Queen is in between. Sternhold and Hopkins is before the Fairy Queen. If you ever tried the Fairy Queen, I'm sure you were defeated. And that's just before Shakespeare. Then there's Shakespeare, right? Then there's all the Puritan plain writing, and then there's the Restoration and Jacobean playwrights and all that stuff. So the language has really changed, and it continues to change. And they said, we've got to do something that modern. We just do it the right way, just so people understand the thing. So these two guys, Nahum Tate and Nicholas Brady, wrote an essay to that effect. They got the king's attention, and he said, okay, go do it. They were, unfortunately for the CV, not especially good poets, but Tate at least was okay. And he was okay with Augustan lyric. He was good enough to write the libretto for Henry Purcell's opera Dido and Aeneas, some of you may have heard of. And Brady was an Anglican priest, a poet and a translator, but he also happened to be chaplain in ordinary to Queen Mary, which meant he had some clout with the Queen. So Tate the poet, Brady the courtier and poet, together they go and they produce a new version of the Psalms of David. It was not roaringly received by everybody, but it got enough purchase, especially in high places, to serve as the vehicle, the prime liturgical vehicle for this ongoing effort to rebuild the Church of England after William and Mary came in. You had the Restoration, and then you have the Glorious Revolution of 1688, which brought William and Mary in, and they really want to renew the Church of England, I guess you'd say, again. And this is the vehicle for it. You reinvigorate the singing, you reinvigorate the worship, you reinvigorate attention to Scripture, and you're good to go. And you're going to improve the church. So this is the first time in 130 years that anything's been done to these psalm texts. They're new, they're modern, they're intelligible. Okay. And then they do something else. Emily, I think what's next is going to be what's next. No, it isn't. Boy, I really left a lot out. Well, that's okay. Ignore what you're saying. We had a technical issue before we went on. They published in 4 years after the new version, they published something called, imaginatively, a supplement to the new version of the Psalms, which was all the words and tunes for all the Psalms, like the old one. But the tunes, a lot of the tunes were new. And they were coming from these court and cathedral composers from the Restoration on, who had been starting to write operas, writing oratorios, deprovincializing English music, which was glorious. But William Byrd is William Byrd. These guys are writing music that you could, a German could understand. And we're not even to Bach yet, but a German could begin to understand this. They're getting to Baroque, and they're writing good Baroque music. So a bunch of new tunes are available in this new edition. of the Psalms. Okay. So 2 years after the new version, no, I'm sorry, the King's Chapel is 6 years old, 7 years old, 8 years old when this new thing comes out. Of course, they order it, they bring it, they're already distributing singing psalms. Now they have a new formula of singing psalms, new music and new words for an old Reformation imperative to sing the psalms in worship. So they're all dressed up and ready to go with the latest London fashion in language and in music. See? And they're in that wretched little wooden church. And that's how it's going to go for a while. Meanwhile, what are the Puritans doing? The Congregationalists. This is what they're doing. Some of you may have heard of the Bay Psalm book, I dare say, which is not what it's called. What it's called is the whole book of Psalms, faithfully translated in English Reader. It is maybe the first book printed in New England or in New England, or even in the colonies, but there are some competitors that might be a little early. But what it is the Puritans' version of what the Psalter ought to be. And who translates it for them? Why, the learned Puritan ministers, the leader of whom was Richard Mather. He, the father of Increase Mather and the grandfather of Cotton Mather. Those Mathers. He led the effort to make these translations, and they are terrible. They are literal. They are literal, and they try to put it into Hebrew word order because they're all about scholarship. It's got to be completely accurate because we're changing God's language to English. It's got to sound like Hebraic English, whatever. There they are. And, but out it comes. And of course, it becomes the Psalter for the Puritan churches. They are singing it in unison, and they're using some interesting tunes. But let's see what's next. Yes. Okay. Before we get to the tunes, I'm sorry. It's herky jerky because I don't have the slideshow in front of me. It was so bad. Let's go back to how bad it was. It was so bad that the ministers asked the young president of Harvard, Henry Dunster, only the second president of Harvard, of Dunster House, if you know Cambridge, that Dunster, to revise it. And he did a lot. So much so that he gave it another title. So when you hear references to the Bay Psalm book that are dated after 1651, they are not talking about the Bay Psalm book. They're talking about the New England Psalter, which is this collection. It would be easier. The thing is, these titles are too long. So you have to have, so there's the Bay Psalm book and there's the New England Psalter. And this is the one that was more in print all the way through the last half of the 17th century and all the way really through the 18th as well in New England. This is the real deal. So the New England Psalter, Henry Dunster. Okay, let's try what's next. Yes. So they have sort of new words, which by the end of the century aren't like really new, but they're better than the other ones were. And they then, in 1698, take a whack at printing music with their Psalter. Right? Now, the Church of England had been printing music with its Psalter since 1562. There was literally not a font of music print in New England until this time, till the late 17th century. It's early. And so at the very end of the 9th edition, the New England Psalter is this little collection of 13 tunes called the Tunes of the Psalms, with the bass set under each tune. It's melody and bass again. And there's all kinds of theoretical stuff and when and what texts they should be sung to. And the music looks like this. We'll have the next one, please. There you go. This isn't great, right? But you can sort of make it go. And they could. And this stuff underneath is the way they taught people, and I mentioned it earlier, how to read music. This is the syllables that are attached to the notes. So this is fa, 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 so, la, fa, la. And if you know that each of those syllables represents a degree of the scale, and you've memorized it, then I could say to you, sing fa, 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 so. And you know how to do that. And then I say, sing fa, 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 so, la, fa, la. And they could do that. They said, then I could say, you've now learned 1/4 of Oxford tune. And I could teach you to do that. And you'd finish the tune. And you'd know Oxford tune. And you could sing Oxford tune to any text that had the same meter. I'm not going to get too much in the weeds here, but if you're a musician or a poet, poetry, you'll know what I mean. Most of the Psalms were translated in all of these collections I've talked about in 14ers, 8-6, 8-6. They were called 14ers, 8 plus 6. And so 8-6 is the dominant meter of these English Psalms. So they're looking for tunes that follow the same 8-6 metrical pattern. Now, I can't come up with one in the middle of a lecture, otherwise I'd sing it for you. But anyway, trust me, that's how it works. So there's instructions about which tunes go best with which Psalms to help you out. And this is written for parish clerks. The Congregationalists have parish clerks just like the Anglicans do. And they both do the same thing. They lead the singing and keep the records. And they do a bunch of other stuff too, but that's what they do. So this is instructing ministers who could lead and parish clerks who could lead, or venerable leaders who are musical enough to do the leading. Samuel Sewall, the great diarist of early Boston, was a precentor. He was a singing leader, and he had a heck of a time. He had a heck of a time keeping them to the tune. And they were singing these things. This is what they were singing. Okay. All right. So this is what the Puritans, now becoming Congregationalists, are bringing to the table. These are not new tunes, but it's the first time they had ever said, we should all at least learn this many. And they were all from Playford. So they're coming from an unimpeachable Anglican musical source. But it ain't the new version. It is not a supplement to the new version with 150 new tunes, right? Or 150 tunes and a bunch of new ones. So they're outgunned. This really looks kind of not much. The texts are dated. The tunes are old. And there they are, having a great time at King's Chapel, singing the new tunes to the new lyrics. What do you suppose the ministers are going to do when they figured out they're outgunned? They're going to put on a musical offensive. And that's exactly what happens. Okay? You're still with it? Gosh, it's 8 o'clock. Okay, keep going. I'll go faster. So this is chronological order. This is the music supplement to the new version. How about the next one, Emily? Yeah, this is what they look like. And these are only melody because because they didn't want to get into the weeds with harmony. Let other Playfords harmonize. That's not our job. All right, what's next? Okay. So now comes the controversy. And now Old North's arrival in this mess is now about to happen. So there's this guy, this minister, William Sims. He's a minister in a town that I would wager hardly anybody in this audience knows, Radford, Massachusetts. It borders on Haverhill. And that means it's pretty out there for 1720. Well, the ministers and the educators at Harvard, in responding to the new version and its music, the Anglican Psalter began teaching music to Harvard students. It entered the curriculum right then, not by accident. They wanted the ministers they were sending out to be competent in psalmody, in leading psalms. So, William Sims was a recent Harvard graduate, and he goes out to the boonies to this congregation. And their old preceptor dies, and he cordially says, well, would you give me permission to lead the music? That's the minister. What are they going to do? They say, yes, sure, go ahead. He gets up and he starts fa, 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 so, la, la, so, fa, fa. When he's leading the psalm, the psalm tunes. They're going, what the hell is that? I said, fa, 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 so, so, la, fa, la. And they go, that sounds like Latin. And you know who uses Latin in worship? The Pope. So they literally think he's like teaching them some kind of popish way of singing. And they hit the roof. They just go bonkers. So he doubles down on it. He says, no, this is scientific music. And they're going, the hell it is. They're not going for it. So he publishes this, which is the opening salvo of this controversy. The reasonableness of regular singing or singing by note, which is what the fa, fa, la, la is. Okay. This goes 3 more rounds. He publishes a unique document. It's actually a script. It's a script of a dialogue between a minister and a parishioner in which they're debating the regular singing's rightness or wrongness. And it's a savage satire on the lay folk. He's just ripping them. And of course, the lay folk have no spokesperson. And suddenly, out of the woodwork, start coming all these pamphlets and sermons advocating regular singing, because this involves a deeply troubling phenomenon, which is the resistance of the laity to ministerial leadership and good order. We shall not have that. So now singing by note becomes a necessary reform that must be accepted by all the laity in order to secure the good order and decency of the ministry. Wow, who knew? So they touch off of dynamite, and this is where they are. And these pamphlets keep pouring in. So we can go to the next. So one of those ministers is Thomas Walter of Roxbury. Brilliant, talented, a musician, quite young, he's in his 20s. But he's been taught music at Harvard. And so he publishes what is now called a tune book. I'll show you a page. These are oblong pamphlets that contain scores through which a minister or a clerk or a new character called a singing master could teach this syllabic way of reading music and make the congregation musically literate. They're called singing schools. So Emily, next. This is what they look like. Now, they're still using the old notation, but this is 3-part harmony. And some of these harmonizations are not from Playford or Ravenscroft. They're original. So these guys are getting into it, getting into the composing game, the singing school game, and they think ministers ought to do this. They think clerks ought to do this, and they think singing masters should teach their people. This is 1721. They're rising, they're still beating down their laity. This kind of score and manual looks like what's being published at exactly the same time in London for exactly the same purpose by Anglicans. So there's your Anglicization. They've appropriated this form of the tune book from London, from Anglican practice, tried it out here, and in a desperate hope that at least their music will get better. And they also, well, they're still running with 1651, but that's what they do. Meanwhile, guess what's going up on Copp's Hill? As a challenge, and a very prominent one visually, to whatever the Congregationalists have. And this is a beautiful new church. It's better than anything that's in town. And it's going to have good music too. It's not going to have an organ, but it's going to have good music, by God. And we'll get a clerk or a precentor to do this in the proper English way. And we'll see whether whether these congregations can match up with us or not. Okay, so next, Emily, please. So we'll just look at this for a while. And remember what I said a moment ago about when we began, about how narrow that gallery is, that front gallery is. It's also known as the West Gallery if your church is located so that it faces east, like a Christian church is supposed to do, but you can't always do it. So where does support for common singing of the Psalms come from? If you have the person up in front trying to lead it, and everybody's following that, well, you really could get a mess like Sims got in Bradford. But if you had some voices in your congregation, you could get a group together who love to sing psalms, and you could put them in the back of the church and have them wail when the leader starts the tune. That helps the rest of the congregation to stay in tune and stay in rhythm. This is how choirs began. Okay, they built the church with the notion that there would be a choir or a support singing group in the back, unless and until they got an organ. And that's what I think was going on in those first years. I'm going to review all that in a second. And when 13 years later, they raise the money and find somebody to build them an organ, it goes in here. It's a lot smaller than this one. But anything in that gallery is going to wipe out. It's not going to make it easy for there to be a choir there. So I assume, I don't know this, that the choir, if there was one, went somewhere else, or if there wasn't one, that an organ would take care of it. It would take care of the musical support. Okay, so that's what I think is So this is the first time in New England that there is a full-scale Anglican London-sized parish church that has all the bells and whistles. And one of the whistles it's lacking is an organ. It's got everything else. And they take care of that soon enough. But let's review again, and then I'll be done. What, having had all this background, confusing as it is, I just try to pull it together. So you're sitting there and it's 1723 or 25 or 30 or 35. You've been there a while. This church is rolling along. What's happening then at that earliest moment? They only sang psalms and biblical canticles, and almost certainly sang the new version of the Psalms. Almost certainly. It's very unlikely that they had any musical resources to attempt anything bigger. 1730, wow. There's certainly harmonized texts of some of those compositions to some of those special canticles, but I think that's probably beyond their ability. The precentor who led the psalmody was probably the parish clerk, but the records I've seen say that there were clerks for the vestry and clerks for the wardens, but they didn't seem to do this. They just kept the records. So somebody else probably sat in the clerk's desk and led singing from there, maybe using those syllables, fa, sol, la syllables. There's no reason why they wouldn't have. The most like there's a candidate for this, a man named William Price. Price was a very early vestryman and a junior and senior warden, and he was a very close friend of Timothy Cutler, the first rector. They were thick. So you have this talented, able musician, you got a new church, and you need somebody to lead the singing who's a pro and everybody knows. Duh, you ask him to do it. I don't have proof, but he's the logical kind of person, let's just say, to do it. I suspect he is, because when they put the organ in, he's the first organist. So he's a competent, trained musician. So he's going to be leading music before the organ and after the organ, and that's just what he did. At least I think so. It's possible before the organ came, because of Price, who may have formed a choir, that there could have been a choir to sing harmonized versions of some of these psalms as an anthem in the service, in the liturgy. It's possible. They would have come from Ravenscroft or Playford. And if there was a choir singing harmony, they would be singing from the West Gallery or the front gallery. That had begun to become very popular in rural churches where there weren't any organs. It's called West Gallery music. And there's thousands of West Gallery compositions and hundreds of West Gallery tune books like Walter's. And there's a lot of original compositions and a lot of traditional tunes harmonized, three parts, four parts. This kind of literature was available certainly by the 1730s. And it's quite possible they might have gone that far. That's possible. But all of this is unaccompanied. Then comes the organ. And there might have been one instrument that they used. And that's called, and that would have been a bass instrument. Right? Melody and bass. Melody and bass. Well, if you don't want your congregation to try singing in parts, or you don't have enough basses, you could put a bass instrument in that gallery. And they did. They were cellos or string basses, or my favorite, the serpent. I don't know if you know what a serpent is. It is a very early bass horn. and it's not made out of brass. It's made out of something or other. It's black. And, a French horn spins and a tuba spins to get the low tone. These twist. They're black with brass valves and ornaments. You can see serpents at Symphony Hall. You go and look at the instruments next time. Look for a serpent. I have a very good friend who's a virtuoso serpent player. He's English, of course. All right. So the organ era begins with the first organ built by William Clagett of Newport and first played in 1736. William Price, the aforementioned, was appointed organist and was the first organist for about 4 or 5 years. They had no luck at all securing a long-term organist. They came, they went, they went, they came. This is not unusual, even in England, let alone in America. So nonetheless, they got by with it. I'm not really going to imagine that they had a choir that could do very much with that early organ. But when the William Johnston organ got installed, that's a game changer. It's a big instrument. It's a big instrument. It's got 16-foot pipes, which means it'll make a good solid bass sound. And you know better than I what it does sound like. I've heard it a few times. It's a proper organ. It's a proper organ for that space. And frankly, you couldn't get much bigger one in there. So you're maxing out now. At that point, and you're in the 1750s, you're starting to get more accomplished singing school music, compositions from these anthologies, and the court and cathedral composers are still composing. It's not hard to get an anthem. In the Anglican tradition, they're known as verse anthems, because you set one verse of scripture. And that gives you a good chunk of it, 3, 4, 5 lines. You can do something musically with that and do it in such a way that isn't just going to overwhelm. We're not talking Handel and Bach here, but we are talking a pretty good sound with that organ pumping behind it. So that's where they're going to go. But what I want to say in sort of by way of conclusion is to bring it back to Anglicization. So I think what happens is that final slide. I think there is one more. I think there's one more, Emily. Yeah. In the end, the Congregationalists were at a very great disadvantage, because this is the front gallery, West Gallery of Old South. No organ. Never. There's a little pumper in there, but actually, if you've ever been there, little pumper, that's all. So they're still singing a cappella. They're still singing probably in unison as a congregation, even in the 1740s. And harmony starts to come in, and there's a choir in there eventually, but any harmony and any musical support has got to be vocal, not instrumental. So musically speaking, Old North clinches the deal in being the more anglicized, more London Baroque competitor. The Congregationalists can only go so far. They get halfway there, but they're going to stay with their traditional tunes mostly, and certainly their traditional texts, and they do. So one goes all the way to the finish line with Anglicization, and they already were, let's face it. And the Congregationalists go as far as a genuinely colonial and non-Anglican community probably could go. And so the Anglicization hypothesis helps us see a bigger picture. And also when you wheel in the timeline for these this progression of psalters and tune collections, to see that this is a vigorous competition, and that there is a larger colonial cultural shift that helps push it and leaves us in really 1736, if not 1759, with that story of the Psalters and the singers at early Old North. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Steve.
You're welcome. I feel like I was working with one hand. Thank you for helping me.
Yeah, no,
Anyway, there we go.
You did a wonderful job adapting to the slideshow, and really, I think, shared a really interesting story. I think what you said about that timeline that we see the Congregationalist Church and then the Anglican Church updating their psalms, but updating them in different ways. I think that really points to that competition that they
because
had.
I haven't tried this out with too many people, so I'm interested in your comments, and thank you, Emily, for that.
Yeah, well, if people do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, and I see them coming in, so I'm gonna ask you a few. Yeah. So one question: Samuel Sewall's diary contains references to his wife's harpsichord before the turn of the 18th century. Why was Congregational Boston more willing to embrace instrumental music than singing?
Well, they weren't. They were perfectly happy to sing. Let's remember. I mean, they sang every Sunday, and they sang the Psalms, but they sang them in unison, and they sang them without art. I think the answer is precisely the Westminster Confession, Calvinist confession, that just insisted that only the Psalms must be sung, and they must be sung in unison. So what you do in church is that. So what you do at home turns out to be your business. And so there were harpsichords. A very good question. Close reader of Sewall is always near and dear. There are references all over the place to instruments, violins, and of course, the first organ in the city was King's Chapel's organ, 1713, that they received from the treasurer of Harvard, Thomas Brattle, whose last name you may have heard of. And he gave it to King's because he knew he couldn't give it to Old South. They wouldn't use it. So even by Sewall's time, even by 1690s, even earlier, the city was prosperous enough and international enough to have international musicians, at least some, and adopting, and this is arguably part of Anglicization as well, parlor music. And what do you do with that harpsichord? It's gendered, she plays probably Elizabethan stuff, that would be suitable, in the parlor for guests or at dinner time, maybe not on the Sabbath, like that. That's what I would say, roughly speaking.
We have another question in here, kind of related. Were any other instruments used for the accompaniment in the absence of the organ, like a piano or harpsichord?
No to piano and no to harpsichord. Pianos really weren't there yet. It was harpsichords. Clavichords weren't loud enough to do the job. So something I didn't say, but I had written down. Let's go back to those singing schools and those rural parish choirs in England, in rural England. In there, they were Anglican, and they didn't have organs, but there was no prohibition on using instruments to accompany sacred singing. None. So guess what they did? They all went up to the West Gallery. They brought their instruments, they got a hold of harmonized versions of the psalm that everyone was going to sing. And they played those parts while the folks down on the floor sang the melody. And they had fiddles, violins. They had early clarinets, probably recorders at this time. Recorders, serpents, possibly shawms, early oboe kind of instrument. And they had little bands of about, maybe a cello. And they had little bands of 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 playing this harmony. And if they had a little local choir, they would be singing in parts as well to support the congregation. And if the congregation didn't get too disoriented, that's how it would work. Now, did Old North do that or not in those first 13 years? In principle, they could, but when you look at the building, it doesn't feel like a rural English country parish enterprise. And these folks want to be downtown. So I would not think so. But apropos the first question, I would be confident that there would be enough instruments in this congregation to do that if they wanted to. I just haven't seen any record of it, but it may be locked away in that great records collection you guys have.
Another question, would the more elaborate style of music in the Anglican style have attracted Congregationalists to Old North?
I think that answer has to be yes. And it's because it's a sophisticated city, even in 1725, certainly by the 1760s. And then, as now, the music program is one of the 3 most important things that you have going for you if you want to grow a congregation. So I think not only the probably better performed and more accomplished music performances and practices, but also the effectiveness of the Anglican middle way theologically. Yes, you have the articles of religion, and yes, you have this, and yes, you have that. But you also know, if you're following this at all, that there's all kinds of debate going on in the early 18th century church. And it's already high church and low church. And there's all kinds of folks mixing it up over there. And they're trying to grow these congregations. So you might very well find more range of theological opinion in an Anglican church than you would in a congregational one. In a congregational one of them might be this way and another one might be that way. But this strikes me as a much more cosmopolitan enterprise. And for an intellectual elite, and there certainly was one, and a mercantile elite, and there certainly was one, I think that would be attractive, and I would think the better music would be a draw.
Another question, I was wondering this too. In that era, would there have been any non-hymn music like preludes and postludes?
No, good question though, because I was going to say that too, but I got so flummoxed. There would be after 1736. And again, it's a question. You're on the far edge of the Atlantic, but a lot of these organists are English. One of them is Huguenot. So when you have an organ, that does change everything in terms of the musical environment. So the organist is supposed to support support the singing quietly, not overwhelm it, not try to force folks to sing louder or anything. There's big debates about this. But the organist also plays preludes and postludes, and they're called voluntaries. And so the voluntary will be before and another one after. And that adds public virtuosity. So, boy, congregationalists have nothing like it. And then there's this thing that's very controversial at mid-century of intervals. They're called intervals. So you're singing a psalm, right? And you're going along, and then you've gotten to the end of the tune, and then the next verse of the psalm should follow. But you need a break. There's a little break in there. Normally, if you're singing a hymn today, you just kind of take a breath and you go on. Not then. Then, this is very Baroque, the organist would intervene and play a little 8-bar, 16-bar thing, often an improvisation on the tune we just heard, or maybe on the tune we just heard. And then we'll go beep, and then everybody would know that it's time to sing again. And they would start to sing again. So intervals, so there's a lot of improvised playing. And that's significant. If your organist is no good at it, it's not a good organist. But if they are, that's a highlight act. That's one of the best musical performances in town, apropos of several of the questions.
All right, I think we have time for one more question. Was that John Playford of English dancing master fame?
It was very much John Playford of English dancing master. He was a very, very important fellow. And both of those works had huge impact. It's not very often that you find a non-court and cathedral figure being essentially a profoundly important music editor for the liturgy, and at the same time writing the work on English country dancing. But he did both, and I think he did well for having done so. So yes, it is the same John Playford.
Well, thank you so much, Steve, for your time tonight and for teaching us a little bit more about what it would have sounded like in Boston at Old North in the 18th century.
Well, thank you all so much.